Everybody, and welcome to Dot to Dot. Today we're going to talk about the Rashfakal name and its origins. We're also going to look into some history and lineage of the Normans and how it connects to the Rashfakal map that was presented by Zena Halpern. And at the end, we're going to come to possibly what could be buried on Oak Island, some Roman gold. So let me go to my slideshow and put it up. Now here's the Rashfakal map, and the reason why we're looking into this is because we have the name Francois La Rashfakal. Now we're going to get into where Rashfakal may have came from, this name, and we'll look at also the time period at which Francois was alive, or the Francois were alive. And we're also going to look at this down here, the Lion Cabotement, which may be related to Richard the Lionhearted. And so we'll go and we'll start off here. And another reason we're connecting this lineage to the Zena Halpern's The Rashfakal Map is the Rashfakal Map and La Formula were found by this note that was left by Bill Jackson. And you can read what it says right here, basically alluding to, in the vault theory, the Antiara schematic, the 7 pieces that show the underground tunnel system. But the thing we're going to focus in is this last little note, La Bella Roma, Rollo mi amante l'Ostrica. And that stands for, or translated, means the beautiful Rome, Rollo, my oyster mountain. Now Rollo is basically a Viking, and he was back in the 10th century, and he's the progenitor of the Norman culture, the Normans of France and England. And he says here oyster mountain. Now oyster can allude to the Shakespearean quote of the world is my oyster. And the oyster has a symbolic meaning of hidden knowledge, wisdom, or even prosperity that is hidden within the shell of the oyster, and it needs to be sought out and found. And the mountain could relate to a challenge, or it could relate to the genealogy of Rollo. So in other words, there may be some hidden knowledge in the genealogy of Rollo. So here's the basically the family tree of Rollo. Here he is at the top. He was a Viking. He married a French princess after the siege of France. He was also a very much involved in the raids on Western France in Aquitaine in the 9th century, and we'll get to the area of Aquitaine a little bit later. But he also is the father of William I, the Longsword. And if you remember my last video in the Royston Caves, I believe, this is my opinion, that William I, the Longsword, is represented in the Royston Cave, which depicts basically a lot of members in this genealogy, mainly Richard I, the Lionhearted, and also Henry II, the King of England. So Rollo descendants end up with William the Conqueror, who was the first Norman king of England. He was also the Duke of Normandy. So he had a vast region in France. He was a vassal to the King of France, but he was also the King of England. So this is where the Normans really accelerate. And then he has a son, and one of them becomes King of England. He dies. And then Henry I is basically the last king of England that has a direct heir, or a son, direct heir, because nobody has any more sons after Henry I, and it becomes basically right here. So here's William the Conqueror and Henry I. Now, Henry I was married to Matilda, the Queen of Scotland. So here's our link to Scotland for all you Knights Templar that are into the Scottish link. It's right here. And then Henry has a daughter. Okay, so his daughter is a direct descendant of Rollo. However, Henry does not have a son. At least he didn't have one that transferred power. I think he did have one son that died in a shipwreck, the White Shipwreck. But this is where she marries first the Henry V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and he dies, and then she marries Geoffrey Plantagenet of Anjou, the Duke of Anjou, and his father was Fulk V, who was very much connected to Jerusalem and the Knights Templar. And so out of this marriage comes Henry II. Now this is where Richard I comes into play. But also it's a reconnection to Rollo, because Eleanor of Aquitaine she was probably the most powerful woman of her time. She was first the Queen of France, married to Louis VII, and then they had a falling out, and she ended up marrying Henry II, the King of England. And also, she was a descendant of the daughter of Rollo. So Rollo's daughter marries William III, and we'll see that later, and she is a direct descendant of Rollo through their daughter. So they have Richard I, Richard the Lionhearted, and when he dies, John Lackland becomes king. He pretty much loses everything to France, and this is where the Norman dynasty pretty much fades out of France and becomes primarily English. And out of Henry III, the Edwards are born, Edward I, second and third, which later on is the 100-Year War, where England and France are pretty much divided. And that's pretty much the end of the French Normans, which gives them a good reason why maybe in 1347 they had to get out of Dodge. So the early French Norman lineage, this is William III. He was the Duke of Aquitaine. He's the one that gets married to Rollo's daughter, Gerlach. And then their daughter marries Hugh Capet, who becomes the King of France, and they found the Capian dynasty, and France will be ruled by this dynasty until the 18th and the 19th century. So it's really interesting what comes out of Rollo. He's quite the head of a lot of dynasties within France and England. So now with the William III, okay, in reference to William III and Aquitaine. Aquitaine is a region in western France, the largest county or duchy, you should say, of France. And out of that is basically what's called the House of Poitiers. It's a dynasty that starts with Ranulph I of Aquitaine. And then he passes on to Ranulph II. And then we come to Ademar, or Amar, because after Ranulph II, there was like a little bit of a lull of rulership. Nobody knew who to step up, because the guy below him, Ebels, he was first appointed, but the thing is there's something about him maybe being illegitimate. We don't know. There's a lot of missing history here, and we can only speculate. But it was Ademar, and remember this name here, Ademar, or Amar. And he claimed the descendancy because Ebels was illegitimate, and he had some support in France. So, but while he was away, Edamar takes off. I don't know where he goes, maybe on a crusade or something. And while he was away, Ebbles comes in and reestablishes himself as the Count of Poitou. Now, Ebbles fathered the Dukes of Aquitaine. Okay, that's where William III, who married Rollo's daughter, comes in, and his descendants end up being Eleanor of Aquitaine, who is the wife or the queen of first the King of France and then the King of England, Henry II. And all this inheritance comes into play. So after Henry II dies and John Laughlin loses all the land to France, he basically starts the 100 Years' War a century later. But out of the House of Poitiers becomes also the House of Poitiers Antioch, which is Raymond of Poitiers. Now, this name rings a bell because this name is Raymond of Poitiers or Raymond of Poitou, which is in the mythological fairy tale of Melusine, and we're going to see that in a minute. And out of the House of Poitiers, Antioch becomes the House of Poitiers Lusignan. And the Lusignan dynasty is huge, huge. They become probably one of the most prominent dynasties in France and in the Mediterranean. They were the kings of Jerusalem and Cyprus for many centuries, and they had big influence in the area of England and France. So here's the Duchy of Aquitaine. You can see how big it is. And here's the beginnings of the Normans, the Duchy of Normandy, the County of Maine. This is the County of Anjou, where the Count of Anjou, Geoffrey from the House of Plantagenet, starts. And also we have the County of Toulouse, and they are very much integrated through marriages and all kinds of stuff, and they actually have a lot of influence down in here. Again, here's the House of Lusignan, and now we're getting into where the Rashfakals may have come from. Now, this is all just, it's history, but history doesn't have a lot of details when it comes to genealogy. It's very difficult. If you ever done your own family tree, you know what I'm talking about. So the Lusignan family originated in Poitou, near Lusignan in western France in the early 10th century. They ruled several principalities in Europe and in the Levant, which is the Mediterranean. They also had kingdoms in Jerusalem, Cyprus, and Armenia. And they were very influential in England and in France. Huge dynasty. And this is their, basically, the lineage of their rulers from pretty much the Second Crusade, I believe, maybe the Third, all the way up to the end of the 15th century. And they were there during the fall of Acre, and basically, owned all of Cyprus. They owned the island of Cyprus, which was very lucrative, very much a Templar hangout or fortress after Acre fell. And Almaric of Tyre was associated with the Knights Templar. In what respect, I can't remember what side he was on, but he was involved. So here's the tale of Melusine, and this is where we start into where we have a sort of a tie between the Lusignan family and the Rashfakals. We got Hugh the First, the Venerator, which stands for the Hunter. He was the first Lord of Lusignan, and he was the huntsman for the Count of Poitou. Now remember, we talked about the Count of Poitou, And remember the name Adamir was one of the counts of Poitiers after Ranulph II. So he is mentioned in the Chronicles of Saint Maxent, which is a place. It's a priory that was in that region. So we know this is documented at least, and it has been hypothesized that he was the inspiration for the Raymond of Poitou. Now, this writing came out in the end of the 14th century, 1393, I believe. And, lineage is everything. And the Lusignan family, I think by the end of the 14th century, was losing a little bit of their clout. And one of the reasons why this story was made was in order to bolster their legitimacy, so to speak. Here's a picture that was painted in 1412. And if you look at the top here, this is supposed to be Melusine as a dragon. She not only turns into, on Saturday night, she not only turns into like a water serpent or a mermaid, but the story goes that she also got in a fight with her husband and turned into a dragon and flew away. But she watches over the castle as sort of like a protector. And this is supposed to be her up here. So the origins of this legend are interesting because they're both Scottish and Gaelic, and they're also French. And this tale emanates from the Swan Maiden or Valkyrie motif. And this style of legend is basically seen a lot throughout the world, but this one more closely mimics the Germanic and Norse mythology. And it's interesting that somewhere, and I don't know where, but there's this claim that Melusine, as a direct descendant or ancestor, was boasted by Richard I, the King of England. Now that's way before the 1300s. So before this was in writing, there was an oral tradition of perhaps this Melusine tale being related to Richard I. Now I'm just wondering, is this Melusine tale connected to their pagan ancestry or their Viking ancestry through Rollo? So the legend of Melusine first appeared in print in 1393, and then it was revised for political purposes, commissioned by Jean-Duc de Berry of the House of Lusignan to make Melusine more sympathetic as the founder of the Lusignan dynasty. So it's sort of like a campaign, a propaganda campaign for this time period where people pretty much probably believed in stuff like this, to basically say, hey, this is mine because it's been gifted to me from this supernatural fairy serpent. Here's also a picture of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. And if you notice, there is two dragons here. Maybe Melusine is represented with this dragon, and that the Henry II, not being a direct descendant of Rollo, but his wife was a direct descendant. There is maybe a second generation here depicted with another dragon. But this Avingian family had a tradition that they claimed descendants from the fairy Melusine. So the origins of the Rashfakal name. So here's the achievement of arms of the Dukes of Rashfakal. And this is one of the reasons why the Rashfakals say that they may be linked to Melusine is the evidence is this depiction of Melusine right here. And this duke's this achievement of arms was pretty much made up when they became the Dukes of Rashfakal. And the Dukes of Rashfakal weren't until the 17th century, I believe. So it wasn't until a lot later that this achievement of arms was represented. So, as I've said before, the authors have advanced, but without evidence, that the first members of this family, Adhemar, known as the son of the Lord Hugh I of Lusignan, is this later has been hypothesized to be reinforced by the armorial bearings of the family with the depiction of Melusine. So the way it goes is Hugh the first Lord of Lusignan, he was the huntsman for the Count of Poitou. Now remember, back when I showed you before, the Count of Poitou, at pretty much during this time period, maybe a little bit, around this time period, was Adhemar, or Amir. And Amir was the first Rashfakal, or Adhemar was the first de Rashfakal. This is the first person in the Rashfakal family tree. Now, the timing, if you notice, this is a little late. So I doubt if he's really the son of Hugh I, but possibly, remember, Adhemar, the Count of Poitou, was deposed by Ebbles. And what did he do after that? Well, he may have had some kids, and we don't know because there's no lineage from these people. And it may be possible that the grandson of Adhemar, the Count of Poitou, and Hugh I, because he was the huntsman of the Count of Poitou when Adhemar, the Count of Poitou, was in power. So they could have had kids that hooked up and had this one. It's really virtually unknown. But this is where they say that this comes from, where the connection from the Lusignan family and the Melusine supports that. And then after Adhemar Fakal the first came, and he was called the Lord of de la Roche, and then Guy the First, he founded a priory called St. Florence de la Rochefoucauld. So this is basically an area, a region. And so the Guy the Second de la Roche, he was called the Lord of Rochefoucauld. Now this isn't in the lineage, but I find it interesting. This is Honor of Châtelherault, and she was also known as Honor of Rochefoucauld, de Rochefoucauld, and she was the mother of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, down through history, it finally ends up being Guy V, who becomes the first Guy V of La Rochefoucauld in 1230. So this is where the name is fully developed into Rochefoucauld. Now, after that, there's several other Rochefoucauds, most of them guys, and they all use the same name. And there are 20 generations of Francois, and they start in somewhere around the early to middle 1500s and all the way pretty much to present day. There's actually a Francois Rochefoucauld that was born in 1984, but he's not Francois the 20th, he's just Francois. But in 1958 was born Francois the 19th de la Rochefoucauld. So, and this is Rochefoucauld the 6th, and he was around, he was the writer that was pretty much, he's the famous Rashfakal writer. So you can see that the Francois La Rochefoucauld up in this corner, it couldn't have been produced anything prior to the mid 1500s. So this is definitely a document that was copied somehow, that perhaps is information that was passed down through someone in the lineage of the Rashfakal. Now, let's see. We're going to talk about the Lion of Tumult, the Lion Cub of Tumult. And from 1152 to 1204, the Castle of Tumult was owned by the English. And King Richard the Lionheart spent a lot of time there. I think he pretty much probably lived there. Most of his time was spent in the Middle East. Matter of fact, he was pretty much a crusader his whole life. And he was actually called the Lord of Tumult. And this is the Castle of Tumult right here. And it was supposedly demolished in the 1600s by Cardinal Richelieu. I don't know what he was looking for, but it's pretty much still standing, a large portion of it. So we're going to talk about some Roman gold. So one of the mythologies that is related to Richard I is in March of 1199. Richard was in Melusine, suppressing a revolt by the Viscount Amory V of the Limoges, and besieged the tiny, virtually unarmed castle of Chalus. And some chroniclers claim that this was because a local peasant had uncovered a treasure trove of Roman gold. And then on March 26, Richard was hit in the shoulder with a crossbow bolt, and it turned gangrenous, and Richard died. Almost 2 weeks later, he died. And the noble thing about Richard is he forgave basically, I guess it was a kid that shot him with the crossbow, ordered him to be set free. There's also some things that he gave him 100 shillings. And then Richard died there. So this was one of the last acts of Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. So this is the chronicler account of Richard's death. And it says that basically the same thing. You can read it if you like. One of the things I want to note here is that the Anglo-Normans, they pretty much blamed Richard for having a lust for gold and everything like that. But he was so forgiving, and he was such a crusader. You know, they gave him a good light, that he was very much a noble man, while the French chroniclers basically said, hey, he got what he deserved. So definitely, even during Richard I, probably because of Queen Aquitaine and the falling out with her with the King of France, the Normans were pretty much on their own in France. They were going to become alienated by the Normans of England, and actually fight against them in the 100-Year War, and the France pretty much takes away all their entitlements, and they have to make up stories and fairy tales in order to keep their lineage alive. So I see this as a motive, especially during the late or middle 1300s, that they may want to be getting out of this situation and start up a new life with perhaps a hidden Roman treasure trove to start up in the New World. And they had the Viking heritage to find their way. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe, and I'll talk to you later.